New topic, a strong start for the nation. And our first subtopic will be the election of 1789, choosing a leader for the new United States of America. So our overall topic is a strong start for the nation. Our first subtopic will be the election of 1789, choosing a leader for the new United States of America. Now, when it came time to choose a leader for this newly formed United States of America, all the members of the Congress had two issues of experience that needed to be changed. Okay, they were used to two things that aren't going to work in choosing a new leader for this United States of America. The first one was that Congress was only accustomed to a monarchy. Anybody know what a monarchy is? Kings and queens. And how do you determine your leaders in a monarchy? It's determined by bloodline. So that's what they were used to. They weren't used to having a leader that was not part of a bloodline. That was a problem. They were used to a monarchy with kings and queens. And they're not going to have kings and queens in this new United States of America. So that's one thing that needed to change, is their philosophy on leadership coming from a monarchy where the rulers were a result of a bloodline. So the king and queen are replaced by their children, were replaced by their children, etc. That doesn't make you good leaders, it just makes you good bloodline. And so they had to get used to getting away from that. The second thing is, all of Congress's experience was dealing with colonial governments, not a government that encompasses all, or a federal government. Remember, the colonies ruled themselves, right? They had their own rules and regulations. We did not have a federal government at that time. So the only experience that any of these members of Congress had was dealing from colonial, which are now going to be state governments, because we're now free from Great Britain. So Congress was only accustomed to a monarchy where rulers came as a result of bloodline, and Congress had no national government experience, as all of their experience came from colonial and now would be state governments. Okay? So they have the task of electing a leader to guide the new United States of America. Okay, and how do they do that? Because they're not used to the way things have to be. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where something that affects us today and affected us in the election of 2017 started. The Electoral College. Okay? Congress developed the Electoral College prior to the first election in our country. Now, if you know anything about an Electoral College, each state has a certain number of electors. And what is another name for an elector? Or a voter. Okay? Now, this is kind of an interesting philosophy, because how do they determine how many electors or votes a state gets? Based on population. Okay? So, the Electoral College was developed, as you know it pretty much now, way back in 1789. And it had an impact on the election of 2017. Because Hillary Clinton, whether you liked it or didn't like it, received more popular votes than Donald Trump. Donald Trump won the election because he won the Electoral College. Now, to make sure you understand that, each state has how many senators? Two. How many representatives do states have? It depends on population. Okay, Wyoming has 2 senators and a representative. They have 3 electoral votes. So if the population of Wyoming is 500,000 and 499,999 people vote for Peyton and 1 person votes for Elisa, Peyton still only gets 3 electoral votes. Okay? Now, your question might be, why in the world did they ever start this process? Well, there were 2 reasons why congressmen in this era started the Electoral College. 2 reasons why. First of all, Congress believed they should vote on the president because of their experience with the candidates, right? They're politically active with the candidates. So they thought, well, being we're politically active with the candidates, we should be the ones that vote them. Which really takes us to our second reason, is they believed that they should vote for the president because most citizens in the new states would not know enough about the presidential candidates to cast a legitimate vote. Because do you think some backwoodsman over here in Kentucky has any idea probably who John Adams is maybe, or any of these presidential candidates? And Congress is thinking, Congress needs to elect the president. One, we know the people, and we know their experience, we've been around them, and two, we can't let these citizens vote. They wouldn't even know who they were voting for. There wasn't television and campaign ads and all that stuff then, so how would somebody in Tennessee even know who the candidates were? How would you know? By the time you got word to them, the election would be over. So those are the reasons why we have an electoral college, is because Congress believed that they, or the electors, should be the one to vote for the President of the United States. They had experience with the candidates. They also believed that they, the electors, should vote for President of the United States because other people didn't know the candidates. Now, in a present-day election, if Wyoming goes for Peyton, okay, does John Barrasso, Mike Enzi, and Liz Cheney, are they bound to vote their electoral votes for Peyton? No. If Liz Cheney wants to still vote for Elisa, even though she only got one vote, she can do that because she's the elector. She's the one casting the vote, not you as people. They actually do. So after this presidential election, all these senators and representatives had to go cast their elector votes for who their state voted in. And 99.99999% of the time, the elector votes for who the people say. But they don't have to. Which tells you that the vote still is being made for president by who? The electors. That's still the way it is today. Just keep that in mind. Now, things were different then, and when they got ready for this presidential election of 1789, Congress agreed that the person who had the most elector votes would be president, and whoever had the second most would be vice president. So there was no political parties at this time. There were no teaming up, you're running for president, I'm with you. It was simply the people that wanted to run for president. The top vote getter was president, the second vote getter was vice president. So, on February 4th of 1789, these congressmen and senators, or electors as we know them, all met in their respective states. If you were from Georgia, you went to Georgia. If you were from Virginia, you went to Virginia. And they cast their ballot for President of the United States. Okay? They all went to their home states and voted. Now, when all these votes came in, George Washington was elected president. Why?
Because he
had the most votes. Actually, he got all of them, which was a little unusual. So on the first ballot, okay, he got all the votes. So what don't we have? So they had to have a second ballot, and they took the other candidates that were running for president, so to speak, and they voted again, and when they voted again, John Adams won the vice presidency. Okay, does that make sense? So the first ballot, every single elector voted for George Washington. So they had to have a second ballot, and when they did that, John Adams had the most votes and became the next first vice president. Now, once that was done, the controversy came up of what are we going to call this guy? Because I said President of the United States, but they really weren't voting for President of the United States. They were voting for a leader for our new country. So the controversy came, what are we going to call this person? Well, John Adams wanted to refer to it as, instead of the President of the United States, His Majesty the President. That's what he wanted to call it. His Majesty the President. Now, who do you think that had to be run by before it made sense, or before it would happen?
Congress.
Well, even who else might want to have some say in what he's called?
Washington.
Washington. Well, Washington didn't like that. He didn't like His Majesty, because that was part of a monarchy. And according to the rules of monarchy, anyone that said His Majesty to you, you were forced to shake hands with. So he'd have to say His Majesty. Oh, and he had to shake hands with everybody. If somebody called him His Majesty, he'd have to go by and shake every hand. He didn't like shaking hands. So he didn't want to be His Majesty. He first thought that the proper term would be His Excellency, the President. But he didn't like that either, so later the title just kind of slithered into President of the United States. But it could have been His Majesty the President, His Excellency the President. Too much monarchy in those, and so they settled on the President of the United States. Yeah?
We've only had guy presidents, and so we've always had a bunch of first ladies, but if a girl became the president, what would her husband be called?
First Gentleman. That was talked about because if Hillary Clinton would have won, we would have had that situation.
Whoa, that would have been weird.
Yeah.
She would have been a president.
president.
Anyway, moving on. So, not only was a president elected in the election of 1789, but they revamped Congress and made it a little bit reorganized. And so what they decided when they were done is there would be 26 senators in Congress. 2 from each state. 13 states at the time. Even though we got this landmass, did that mean that we had more states? They hadn't established states yet. So there would be 26 senators, 2 from each state, and there would be 59 representatives from states depending on population. So each state didn't have the same. So the new Congress that's reorganized in 1789 consists of 26 senators, 2 from each state, and 59 representatives from various states based on population. Okay, any questions on that at all? Okay, let's talk about the inauguration of the first president. Now generally, a president is elected nowadays in November, and they take office the 3rd week of January. That's when they're inaugurated. That's not quite how it was at this point. George Washington wasn't inaugurated until April 30th of 1789 because they voted on February 4th. Okay, now you vote in November and you're inaugurating the 3rd week in January. He was elected in February and then is going to be inaugurated on April 30th, 1789. Anybody know where the capital of the United States of America was located at that time? No, good guess. A lot of people think Philadelphia.
Philadelphia, Boston.
New York?
New York City. So, on April 30th of 1789, a big crowd gathered in New York City. Anybody want to guess what street he was inaugurated on? You'd think that, but it's a
Inauguration.
financial street. Wall Street. So he was actually inaugurated on Wall Street before Wall Street had anything to do with finances. So on April 30th of 1789, a crowd gathered at Wall Street in the capital city of New York City for the inauguration of the first president of the United States. Now I think to myself some of the thoughts that must have been going through his mind as he took the oath of office. I think the first thing he was thinking is, how in the world am I going to transform these 13 separate states into one federal government? That would be a full-time job, big chore. So he's thinking, how am I going to transform these 13 separate states into a federal government? If I do, what are the chances that this new government's going to succeed? And if it does succeed, how long will it succeed? I mean, he's got to have all these things going through his mind. My God, I've got to establish 13 individuals into thinking one way. And that's pretty hard to do, okay? All right, now, whose responsibility is it going to be to transform these 13 separate states into one federal government? George Washington and Congress. Okay? So let's talk about creating a presidential cabinet. For the first time in history, we're going to have a presidential cabinet. A little bit different than now, but we'll tell you how it started. Now, President Washington was inaugurated, and all this time he's thinking, how in the world am I going to do this job by myself? So he decides that he's going to need some advisors to assist him on these responsibilities as a president. So he goes to Congress and he asks them for help. And Congress creates 3 departments to help President Washington with his work. They developed 3 departments. Okay? All 3 of these are still in existence today, but one's called something different. What department? What's one department they started? The Department of what? The Department of State. Okay, what does the Department of State do then and today? They help the president handle both foreign and domestic affairs. Don't we have a Secretary of State? Big position in the cabinet. He goes around and negotiates foreign and domestic. What's foreign and domestic mean?
International and
And at home is domestic and international is foreign. So they established the Department of State to help the president handle both foreign and domestic affairs. What other department did they establish? Now that you kind of got the role of it. Financial, which we call the Department of the Treasury. Department of the Treasury. And that department was set up then and today to help the president with financial issues within the nation. Okay, got to help a little bit with the finances. So the Department of the Treasury to help the president with financial issues. What other department will we need to protect ourselves? Department of what? Defense. At that time was called the Department of War. And by the way, it didn't change to the Department of Defense until 1947 under the Truman administration. It went on as the Department of War from 1789 to 1947, and finally Truman's administration changed it to the Department of Defense. Okay? And they helped the president with the 3 M's. 3 M's. Manage military matters. Okay? The Department of War was set up to help the president manage military matters. Now, you can't have a department without a chairman to run the department, and so each of these departments would be appointed a chairman, and that person would be known as a secretary. Thus the name Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of War, now Secretary of Defense. So each of these departments would have a chairman, that a person would become a member, and once you were a chairman or a secretary, you were a member of the president's cabinet. Okay? Now, the president's cabinet serves an advisory role. Whose decision is it final? Who makes the final decision? The president. So these people give him good information. Cuban Missile Crisis, John Kennedy. His cabinet was very much involved in that crisis. But when it came down to brass tacks, he made the final decisions and the tough ones. That's what a president does. Okay? Now, the president's cabinet would be referred to in 1789 and still is today as the executive department. Anybody in the president's cabinet is a member of his executive department. Now, the initial executive department was going to consist of 4 members. So I haven't told you about one department yet, have I? Because it's not a department yet, but he's actually going to pick the person before he establishes the department. And that'll make sense. Now, when Washington started his presidency, he had 4 members of the executive department. 4 secretaries of something. Okay? Although one wasn't called a secretary of anything, and I'll tell you that in a minute. That would increase from 4 to 15 members prior to him leaving office. So this cabinet's going to get bigger. But the initial cabinet had 4 members in it. It's going to have a Secretary of State, a Secretary of the Treasury, a Secretary of War, and one other person we'll talk about. Who did Washington pick as his Secretary of State? Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson. Who did he pick as Secretary of the Treasury? Alexander Hamilton. And who did he pick as his Secretary of War? We have a fort named after him in New York. Henry Knox. Now, Henry Knox had been a general in the Revolutionary War. He had great experience, and Washington tapped him as his Secretary of War. Now, here's another thing the president's going to need help with. He needs help with foreign and domestic affairs. He needs help with finances. He needs help with the military. But he needs some legal assistance. He's not a lawyer. He doesn't know all the legal terms. And so, even though he has not developed a Department of Justice yet, he picks Edmund Randolph to be the nation's first Attorney General. And the Attorney General will advise the President on matters of law. But why didn't he establish a Judicial Department yet? Because we don't have such a thing. Okay, and we're going to talk about that. Okay, we're going to get one, but we don't have one. Now, why did President Washington pick Jefferson, Hamilton, Knox, and Randolph for his cabinet? Because they were both brilliant in theory and brilliant in practice. They weren't there to please him. Like the English crown, he picked them because they were smart people that could help him. He didn't pick them because he wanted them to agree with everything he said. He picked them because they were smart. Okay, that's going to take us to a very important subtopic, which is basic problems of organizing a new federal government. Basic problems in organizing a new federal government. Now, President Washington, Vice President Adams, and this newly elected Congress are going to have several basic problems they're going to need to overcome if they're going to establish a new federal government. And these basic problems are going to fall into three separate categories. So newly elected congressmen, along with the president and vice president, are going to have several basic problems they need to overcome in establishing this new federal government. And these basic problems are going to fall into three separate categories. The first category is judicial problems. What do I mean by judicial problems? What don't we have in the United States of America that would go under that problem area?
Laws.
We don't have any laws. There's number one. We have no laws. So number one under judicial problems is there's no